please open your Bibles, if you would, to 1 John 4, and we're going to start in verse 18. And once you get there, I'm going to pray. I'm going to run a little long since we got a late start. Hopefully you can hold your bellies for about 5 or 10 minutes past the noon hour. Is that okay? All right. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, 1 John 4:18. All right. Thank you, Father, for this opportunity to share your word. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your Son. Thank you for your Holy Spirit. Thank you for allowing us to do all things through Christ, which strengthens us. Thank you for calling us to this ministry. And thank you for calling the people here to receive it. Thank you for this church and this family. Thank you for all you've given us. Now, we receive your wisdom, and we thank you for it. And we let this word go forth. Give us eyes to see, ears to hear, and hearts to understand your word. We thank you, and we receive all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right, 4:18. All right, we're going to stay primarily in this verse today. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but first we're going to tear apart this verse. Rachel, do you have my notes handy over there? Yes, it is. No, it is not. Oh, well. If you find them, bring them to me. I will still wing it. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment. He that fears is not made perfect in love. We love him because he first loved us. I'm going to start looking at the Greek words here and hopefully give you a little bit better idea of what he's actually saying here. Now, this is written by John, the apostle whom Jesus loved. I think that's pretty bold of himself to call himself that in the Gospels. But he is probably the person who was closest to Jesus among his disciples. He went so far as to lay his head on the chest of Jesus, and he heard the very heartbeat of the Son of God. So I think when it comes to talking about Jesus and love and who he really is, John probably knows better than anybody. So that's why I go to him a lot, the Gospel of John and John's letters. So if I want to know about Jesus, if I'm not hearing directly from Jesus himself, I'm going to go to the person who has the best idea about him. So, there is no fear in love. Fear comes from the Greek word phobos. Now, Tom is our resident Greek expert. He's going to fact check me on this. If I get anything wrong, he'll be sure to tell me, and I'm sure he'll share with you too. But phobos is where we get our word phobia. Like when somebody has agoraphobia, they are afraid of crowds, or claustrophobia, they're afraid of closed-in spaces. And phobos is a pretty serious word. It's where the word is often associated with the fear of God. Now, I'm going to address that. When I teach on fear and being fearless, typically the reaction is, what about the fear of God? How can you live fear-free without the fear of God? I'll get to that. Have patience. So phobos is fear. Anytime you see fear mentioned, it comes from that word. So you have a grasp of that now because you've heard phobia. I don't understand triskaidekaphobia, fear of the number 13. That's superstition. People are afraid of clowns too. For the most part, clowns are very nice people. Just want to be nice to kids. Okay, give them a break. They're nice folks. Okay, so phobos, that's fear. Now love, you've probably heard this word before, agape. This is typically referred to as the God kind of love. It's the selfless, self-sacrificial love that you read about in 1 Corinthians 13, and we'll read that shortly. But it's often translated as charity. It's giving without expecting anything back. It's giving of oneself freely. So that's the love that we talk about here. Now, perfect love casts out fear. Perfect here, Tom, you'll appreciate this, comes from the root word telos, which means end, or if you're traveling, you're going to come to an end point, an expected end, the telos. And here, the way it's translated, it comes out perfect, or mature, or full-grown, the Amplified Bible calls it. So this is full-grown love, love that is mature and completely fulfilled. And cast out, I really enjoyed learning about cast out here. Now, this isn't like casting a line when you're fishing. You're not throwing that lure out there to a specific spot to get a fish and reel it in. What's talking about cast out here, it's talking about throwing something away like trash. You're just, like if you're driving along and you throw something out of the car, I don't recommend that. That's littering. When you throw something out of the car, you don't care where it lands. You just want it away from you and out of your car. And that's what it's talking about here. This is the casting out when we read in the Gospels about being cast out into outer darkness. I mean, we're throwing this thing way out there. And out is out. That's exo. That means way out. Right? Clear away from you as far as you can possibly get. So, mature love casts out fear. Fear is not welcome. We heard about Jesus telling his disciples, don't be afraid. We read about that all the way through the Bible. Fear not, fear not, fear not, fear not. If we go to Revelation 1, we'll see what happened when John met the glorified Jesus. Revelation 1:17. Now, he's on the island of Patmos. Actually, we're going to start a little earlier. We're going to start in verse 10, and we'll work up to 17. This is John speaking. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Okay, he's praying. And heard behind me a great voice as if a trumpet. Okay, so I'm picturing John praying in the Spirit, and it's almost like Jesus is sneaking up behind him. I go, ooh, trying to get his attention. But he heard Jesus behind him, so he's not seeing him. He only hears a sound behind him that doesn't sound like the Jesus he knew. The Jesus he knew was flesh and blood. He laid his head on his chest. He heard his heartbeat. This was his best friend. If he knew anybody's voice better than, as well as or better than his own, it was Jesus's. I know Rachel's voice on the other end of the phone. I can hear her across the house. I can pick her voice out of a crowd because we have been intimately involved in a relationship. Now, Jesus and John was very tight with Jesus. So if he heard Jesus' voice at this point, decades after he'd finally seen him in the flesh, he would know it. But this is a strange sound. And he turns around. Here's the voice. It sounds like a trumpet, not just, not like Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. This is the trumpet. This is the loudest sound you could possibly hear. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I'm not going to even try to do it justice. I'm just going to read it normal. The first and the last. And what you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches, and he tells them who to send it to. Verse 12, and I turned to see the voice that spake with me. And being turned, now he starts to see a whole bunch of stuff he's never seen before. There's candlesticks, there's stars, his feet are brass, his hair is white, fire is shooting out of his eyes. This is not the Jesus he knew. This is someone completely different, sounds different, looks different. Now, if he saw the Jesus he knew, his first reaction might be, oh, Lord, I missed you, run up and hug him. Because that's what Mary did. She wanted to reach out and touch him, and he said, no, you have to wait. And we get to verse 17, and after he's done describing everything he's seen and then he's heard, John says, when I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. And he laid his right hand upon me, saying unto me, fear not. Even the glorified Jesus, in all his glory, still wants us to not fear him. Now, we talked about fear, the fear in Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve hid themselves and said, we were afraid of you. Now, the devil got involved, screwed things up. Now fear is in the world. Who were Adam and Eve afraid of? They're afraid of God. And that's a very real thing throughout the Bible, and it's still a very real thing today. When we talk about fear in the context of not just being afraid of the number 13, but when crisis comes, say you get a bad report from the doctor tells you you're developing a condition. Your logical end of that thought is, I'm going to die. Now, for those people who don't know Jesus, what happens to them after they die? Where do they go? They go to judgment. And our unrenewed mind from our unborn-again spirit has that nature inside of us from our past spiritual father, Satan. You remember when Jesus told the religious elite when they said, we have Abraham as our father? And he said, you are of Satan. Satan is your daddy. Uh-oh. That did not go over well. But it's true. And when you have a spiritual father like that, through God, we take on his nature. We are declared righteous. We receive wisdom. We take on all the things that he is. That's why we have the fruit of the Spirit. That's what we produce from our renewed spirit. It's birthed out of that. We birth out what God is. Now, before you get born again, you have his spiritual nature. Well, what's his expected end? He's going into the lake of fire, where he's going to burn forever with all the sin and all the trouble that he's ever caused. All his demons are going to go with him. And unfortunately, everybody that's hanging on to him. Everybody that refuses Jesus and doesn't want to give up that life. So, before we came to Jesus, that was our expected end. And that was what was in our spirit, and that's what came up through our mind, our soul, and that's our natural reaction. When we consider the threat of death, what's coming up out of our spirit is a vision of judgment. So why is John here, an apostle, who is obviously not going to go through this? Why does he drop as dead? Because even the apostles have to renew their mind. That's why Paul wrote that in Romans 12. You have to renew your mind daily. Why? Because Paul had to renew his mind daily. We're doing a great job in here. We're feeding on the word. We're sitting under the anointing. We're sharing fellowship. This is a great time to be together as Christians. But when we walk out of here, if we go to the gas station, if we go to McDonald's, for some folks, even if they go home, that stops. And they are back in reality. They're slapped across the face like they get hit with a sock full of nickels. It is crushing, soul-wrenching reality. You turn on the news, that's not good news. It's all death and despair and all sorts of bad things. So you can fill yourself up on the Bible once a week for 2 hours, if you're lucky, if you go to a great church that does that for you. But if you don't renew your mind daily, getting in the Word, making it a priority, then when trouble comes, fear is going to try to creep itself back into your soul. And when you get a bad report, or your finances are tight, or any other bad news comes your way, you're going to revert to your default setting, which is, oh my God, I'm going to die, and what's going to happen if I die? You don't remember immediately, oh, I'm going to go be with Jesus. This is going to be fine. But it shocks people initially, that sense of fear. And that's what we fight every single day when fear comes at us. Now, we're going to talk about this in the afternoon session, how to tackle these things, how to overcome this. And we've already hinted at this a little bit. Getting in the Word, renewing your mind. But we're going to give you some other practical strategies to stop fear from getting in. If you got a leak in your basement, you got to stop the water from coming in before you do anything else. You know, yeah, people want to get stuff up off the floor as quick as they can, but naturally, most people's reaction is, where's this water coming in from? How do we stop it? And that starts the process of rebuilding. So along with building yourself up, you got to put up boundaries. You got to put walls around yourself to protect it. Whatever's most valuable to you is what you're going to protect. If you don't protect your mind, it's not very valuable to you. So that's why we need to get in the Word. That's why we need to be careful about what we watch, what we hear, who we talk to, who we have conversations with. Now, there have been a lot of fellowships in the past that have said you can't go to picture shows, you can't listen to the radio, you can't go to theater, you can't smoke or chew or go with people who do. So, and they turn that into a religious thing. But if you are motivated by love, and we'll talk about this, you are not going to allow fear anywhere near you. And we're going to talk about what love is. Love is doing whatever God says whenever He says it. Being prepared to minister from God to anyone at any time. And that's what Jesus said. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And He's not talking necessarily about the 10 Commandments. Yes, it's good. It's really important to protect those. Don't lie. You won't have many friends. But you also need to be sensitive to the Spirit, be in the Word, and receive from Him in prayer your commands for the day. This is why forgiveness is so important. In Mark 11, it talks about when you say, believe what you say, and you can have what you say. You can speak to a mountain and cast it into a sea. But you also need to forgive. Why do you need to forgive? Because God is probably going to call you to bless somebody you don't like. Whether I take it as this. Anytime I sense that somebody is getting under my skin, that's a good indicator that I need to bless them immediately. I need to find some way to get some seed into their life and bless them. And if I don't have a seed immediately, I'm going to pray for them. Because this is what it does for me. It locks me in to being on God's side for them. Because if I'm going to God and saying, I want this person to be blessed, I want this person to be prosperous, I want this person to be healed, I'm asking God to get involved in their life. And if at any point I step outside of love and forgiveness and I start coming against that person and finding fault with them, now that person and God are on the other side and I'm against them. That's not a good place to be. So if I want to be on God's side, I want to get him involved in somebody else's life. That ties that down, and that removes all strife and all confusion. Because we talk about in James 3 that where there is strife and envy, where people are at each other's, they're butting heads, there's confusion in every evil work. And we talk a lot about eliminating strife. We should eliminate strife. But underneath that is confusion. People will isolate themselves when they get in strife, or they'll isolate themselves when somebody gets under their skin or bugs them, and then they'll start speculating. The devil will start chattering at them. And then we start speculating about, well, what's their motivation? Well, why did they do this? I saw them the other day, and I said hello, and they didn't say hi back. Does he not like me anymore? What's his problem? Is he, especially in the workplace, if there's a promotion up, ooh, you see the nails come out. And then everybody's competing for one spot, and somebody gets it, and other people don't. Well, why did they pick them? What do they say in their interview? Did they say something against me? Did they tear me down? I have the most seniority. Why did they get picked? And you turn these things over in your mind. These are the same attacks that come against me. Folks, we are not experts on how to live fearlessly. The reason why we were called to do this is because we needed to learn it first. And what we're doing is sharing from our experience. These are the things that we went up against, and these are the strategies that God has given us to overcome this. And it's not like we overcame it, and it's in our past, and we're just going to march on along through life, no big deal. These are the strategies we need every single day. When somebody goes into the military and they go through basic training, they don't go through it once, go in and fight one battle, and they're done. They have to do this day after day after day after day until the war's over or they're called home. So these are things that we have to do every single day. Now, as we get better at it, we'll get called into a higher level of dealing with things, and maybe we'll move on to dealing with something else once we get fear locked down. But this usually is the first step for people. They don't really realize how much fear attacks them, especially born-again, Bible-believing, Spirit-filled people. They think, oh, I'm not afraid. Really? Here's a good example of fear and how it leads to the thought of death and judgment. This seems like a very innocuous thing. Sharing about Jesus or sharing your faith in the workplace. You think, why would people be afraid of that? It's very simple. If you really believe in Jesus, if he really is your Lord, and he puts somebody on your heart to share with them, or there's an opportunity to minister, why wouldn't you minister? Here's the fear thought that comes in that leads to the logical fear of death and judgment. Your unrenewed mind gets a message. If you share the gospel with them, they will report you to human resources. How many times does that ever really happen? We read about it in the news, which is a good reason not to read the news. It happens so rarely. Here's what happens when you share about your faith in the workplace. People will give you a blank stare most of the time and say, oh, and then they'll go back about their business. There are opportunities where people say, well, why do you think that? And then you begin to start sharing about the Bible and what the Bible has to say about situations. And then you have an opportunity to minister. And maybe you don't have the time to sit down with them and go through the whole thing, the whole opportunity for salvation, but you plant a seed where a day will come where they will be in crisis and you will be the person they come to. They'll remember what kind of life you live, what kind of witness you have in the workplace, and how freely you're able to share about that. Why do you seem to handle issues so well? Why do you never get rattled about everything or anything at all? Why are you able to serve people so openly and willingly? Why are you so pleasant all the time? Why do you smile? What kind of goofball are you? Because I have hope. Because nothing's going to faze me. Worst case scenario is I die and go to be with Jesus. Yippee! That's what we should all be hoping for. But what that voice does, they're going to report you to human resources. And they're going to call you in. And they're going to ask you why you did that. And maybe they're going to make you go to special sensitivity training so that you don't offend people anymore. But if you can't hack that, well, then they're going to suspend you. And if they suspend you without pay, you're not going to be able to pay your bills. You're not going to be able to pay for your car note. And then you're going to get your car repossessed. And then you're not going to be able to go to work because you have to commute every day. If you're not able to go to work, eventually they're going to get tired of that and let you go because you already have a mark against you for sharing the gospel in the workplace. And then you're going to lose your job. And you're going to lose it with cause, which means you're not going to be able to get unemployment benefits. You're not going to be able to get unemployment benefits. How are you going to pay your mortgage? How are you going to pay for groceries? Your wife is going to get sick of dealing with this, and she's going to leave you, and she's going to take the kids, and they're going to have to pay child support and alimony. How are you going to afford that with no job and no place to stay and no car? And you're going to end up being homeless, and you live in Michigan, and winter's going to come. Then what are you going to do? What if your coat wears out? What are you going to do then? What are you going to eat? Well, I suppose you could find some raccoons and kill them and skin them and eat them. You can make a raccoon coat, but is that really reasonable? And you don't really like raccoon anyway. Do people eat raccoon? And eventually it's going to be January, it's going to be 30 below, and you're going to starve and freeze to death. And then you realize, first of all, none of that stuff is even remotely going to happen. They're not going to go tell HR. HR doesn't care. And if they do, they're just going to, pull me and say, look, just lay off this person. You keep doing what you're doing. You do a good job. We like having you here. Never mind that. But even if all that played out, what happens if you die from not eating raccoon meat and freezing to death in the middle of the winter? You go to be with Jesus. And hopefully the person you share the gospel with will come be with you at some point too. And they'll get people saved. But see how silly that sounds? But left alone to your own devices, we've all been through this where we start turning things over in our mind when we are alone. We're not meditating on the Word. All fear is irrational. It makes no sense, and it has no logical way of playing itself out. But yet those scenarios they keep coming in and coming in and coming in. I remember reading a story about a man who was morbidly obese. He was a believer. I believe he was a worship leader, but he had become morbidly obese so much that it affected his health and his relationships. And a Christian counselor was talking with him because he was having relationship trouble and career trouble and health trouble. And they got to talking and ministering to him, and he found out that the man had been abused as a child and abused in the most foul way. And his logic and reason in his adolescent brain said, if you eat to the point where you become so morbidly obese you will not be attractive, this will never ever happen to you again. So he ate himself to the point where he became unhealthy, but he thought that was a defense mechanism to keep him from being abused. That sounds really silly. And once he said it out loud, he realized how silly that sounded. He had never told anybody this, but somebody who walked him through the Word saying, this is not who you are. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. God has a purpose for you. He has a hope and a future and an expected end. This is not how He planned for you to live your life. Also, not only have the sins that you have committed been forgiven through Jesus Christ, all the sins that have been committed against you have been forgiven. You don't have to carry that anymore. That's not a burden you need to carry. I've already forgiven that other person. You should too. And more importantly, you should forgive yourself. Jesus took this. You don't have to carry it anymore. But how many people do we know who do this with other things such as alcoholism, drug addiction, pornography addiction, gambling, overeating, frivolous shopping, running up credit card debt? You name it. All the things that befall people, those are all, like this man, coping mechanisms. See, fear attacks your flesh. The Spirit is supposed to work, God's Spirit is supposed to work from the inside out. The Spirit inside talks to the mind, which is part of your soul, and that manifests out through your body. That's how things are supposed to operate. That's how God designed it. The reverse, and less effective because it's the devil, is everything comes from outside attacking your body, which attacks your mind, which attacks your emotions and your will, and then leaves your spirit shriveled and empty and dead. That's the unborn again experience. That is what it's like for people who don't know Jesus, who aren't in his word, who have not received the Holy Spirit. And even those who do don't know how to operate the correct way because they may not have ever been taught the correct way. So they still fight the same problems they had before they got born again. And that's why we have people in the church at large who are still struggling with addictions and bad attitudes and broken relationships, whatever the case may be. Here's why they get these coping mechanisms. Because they are afraid of death and they are afraid of the pending judgment, they're finding any way possible, like the devil, to buy time. See, when the devil was cast out of heaven and put here where we were supposed to rule over him, that's how he got out of line. He spoke up. Eve should have just put him down right then. She was totally capable. She's probably wearing heels. She could have just ground him in the dirt like that. All jokes aside, he was supposed to be here so we would rule over him like everything else. Because he was on the clock. His time was running out. He had an expected end, and it wasn't a good one. But since he pulled Adam and Eve out from under God and brought him under his spiritual nature, then we all became on the clock. If you eat of the fruit, you will die. And the devil said, you won't die. Why? Because the devil knew they wouldn't die physically right away. They died spiritually right away. And then they started the process of physical death. And it took them a long time initially to learn how to die. Adam and Eve lived over to be 900 years old. Now our life expectancy is way, way down because we've learned how to die. We've learned how to live on the clock. Think about how many people feel under pressure by this statement. I'm running out of time. I can't do this. I don't have enough time. I can't pay my bills by this date. I don't have enough money. I'm running out of time. I can't get this cancer cured in time. The medicine's not taking effect. Time, tick, 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 tick. Time is not supposed to affect us. We were not made to operate within the bounds of time. Time was supposed to serve us. The seasons were supposed to be for growing and sowing and harvesting. They weren't supposed to dictate how we lived. We were supposed to dictate how other things lived. But once we got into fear, all of a sudden, we started running out of time. And the devil works by being the accuser, by being the slanderer and the accuser. He finds people to accuse, and he pulls them in front of himself like a human shield so he can excuse himself from his own crimes and turn around and point the finger at them. You loved this person more than you loved me? I was the anointed cherub, and you made this thing and they were going to be glorified? How dare you? They're just as bad or worse than I am. And all he's doing is pushing enough people in front of him to make the line longer and longer and longer, thinking that God won't get to him. What an idiot. Not only is he a liar and a loser, he's an idiot. That's not how it's going to work. He's got a time, and it's running out no matter what he does. But he's got that idea in his head that God has things set up perfectly and logically. It's designed beautifully, but he's so out of whack that he thinks he can manipulate things, and we think we can too. Just by going through those coping mechanisms, like getting drunk or getting high or going out and gambling or buying a bunch of new things or spending money we don't have. Why? Because it turns off the fear receptors on the inside of us. Most of our life, as a great writer said, is lived in quiet desperation. We're constantly trying to stay ahead of the clock, pay our bills on time, spend all our money, then go back to work. 2 weeks later, we get paid again, spend all of that. We're constantly just trying to stay ahead of the debt collector, stay ahead of the Grim Reaper, whatever we want to call it, thinking that we're winning, and we're really running like a rat on a wheel. We can step out of that by getting out of fear and into love and saying, I'm not going to be motivated by my paycheck or by the time clock or what the doctor says. I'm going to do what God says and know that he'll provide for me. He's the one that's our provider. We're not the provider. We lost that because he gave us a whole garden we could eat from. And then once we stepped out of that relationship, he said, you'll have to do this in the sweat of your brow, meaning we're going to have to figure out how to grow this stuff. It's not just going to grow on trees freely anymore. We got to plant this stuff. and we got to fight thorns and thistles, and we got to fight predators. Things got really difficult in a hurry. So those coping mechanisms feed our flesh, turn off our fear receptors, and for an hour, a few hours, a whole night, we feel separated from that pending death and judgment. I don't feel that anymore. You know what? I don't care about the judgment. There is no God. And then you wake up in the morning with a hangover, or you wake up not being able to pay your bills, or who knows what, and it all comes back to you. And even worse, it's doubled for your trouble. More trauma for your mama. All these things we do to try to push off this expected end are fruitless. As a matter of fact, depending on what you're doing to your body, you may be accelerating that meeting with your Lord. That's probably not a good idea if you don't know him. You got to get that straightened out. So, how do we as Christians deal with this? Because we shouldn't have to worry about this. Perfected love, mature love, Jesus kind of love. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 13. And as I said, this is doing whatever God says whenever he says it, to whomever he tells you to do it to, or for. We're going to start in verse 4. I was going to read from the Amplified version. Could you hand me the Amplified Bible, please? I particularly like the way the Amplified Bible does it, because the King James says charity, and I think people lose a lot when they read charity. We don't think about that these days. For some reason, charity has become a kind of organization and not a way to live. Nonprofits are often called charities because they give to the poor and expect nothing in return. Okay, 1 Corinthians 13, starting in verse 4. This is from the Amplified version. Love, agape, endures long and is patient and kind. Love is never envious or boils over with jealousy. Well, that takes care of strife right there. Is not boastful or vainglorious, does not display itself haughtily. It is not conceited, arrogant, and inflated with pride. It is not rude, unmannerly, does not act unbecomingly. Love, God's love in us, does not insist on its own rights or its own way, for it is not self-seeking, it is not touchy or fretful or resentful, meaning it's not going to get in worry and doubt and care and fear. It takes no account of the evil done to it, meaning it's not going to panic and say, I'm running out of time. It does not rejoice in injustice and in righteousness, but rejoices when right and truth prevail. Love bears up under anything and everything that comes. It is ever ready to believe the best of every person. Its hopes are fadeless under all circumstances, and it endures everything without weakening. Love never fails. Here's what fear does to us in relationships. Not only do we have the misdirected notion that we're running out of time, we also think we're running out of resources. We think there's a limited amount to go around, and it's got to be me and mine and nobody else's. What if somebody takes this promotion from me at work? I need the pay increase to pay for my kids. I need to pay for my home. Things are pretty tight right now. That would have helped out a lot. That person took my job, and then you become resentful. And then if they're your supervisor, that's especially bad. If you're supposed to submit and obey to their commands for the good of the company, ask yourself, what's best for the company? But if you are not in a place where you can serve them willingly, if you do it grudgingly, you're not going to do your best job. Not only does that affect the company, it makes your supervisor look bad, and ultimately it's going to make you look bad. And when your annual review comes around, you're probably not going to get a very good review from the supervisor whom you resent, whom you will not obey, and you may end up getting a demotion, or worse, laid off. Now not only have you lost out on the job that you think you deserved, you're now losing out on the provision you already had. And then that solidifies the mindset that there's only so much to go around. It's a competition. It's survival of the fittest. That is a mindset that has removed God from all creation. There is an abundant life in Jesus Christ. There are not enough people to take in all the goodness that God has. I often tell Rachel when we have a good day with the kids, let's have a dozen more. And people, we do say it jokingly, but we would have more. We would have a whole bunch more. If we knew how great this was, we would have started sooner. But people say, well, you can't have 4 or 5 kids. How are you going to pay for them? Not our problem. There's enough of God to go around. God's our provider. He's going to give us a child. He'll provide for it. We've committed to Him. We're in a loving married relationship. We're tithers. It's going to be all right. He wants us to have a child. He puts that on our heart. We're going to do it, and he's going to be provided for. We're not going to sweat it. But there's this mindset out in the world that somebody has more than me. Here's the childish thing you hear in the news and thing you'll hear in every preschool in America. It's not fair. He got more than me. He got more goldfish than I did. He got 6 and I only got 4. You need to take one from him and give it to me. Well, you all had the opportunity to grab as many goldfish as you wanted. He just happened to grab more. You know what? Go back and get more. No. That's not fair. It needs to be equal. That's not how life works. We tell our kids this a lot. Life in the world isn't fair. You're not going to get the same every time. Not everybody gets the same. Some people get more, some people get less. Sometimes it's based on merit. If you're playing organized sports, there's going to be one kid that's going to score all the goals. Deal. You know what? Help him out. Give him an assist. Still looks good on the stat sheet. You're a team player that way. Look, when a team wins a championship, it's for everybody. It's not because of an individual, no matter what the sports media says. We've got to get over this idea that there's only so much to go around, that there's only so much time that we have. Because when we do that, we're negating everything God has said to us about the abundant life. The thief has come to steal, kill, and destroy, according to John 10:10. But Jesus came to give life, and that more abundantly, life in overflow. Why would the thief steal? Because he's in competition. Why do the demons tear people apart in the Gospels? Legion, the demons that call themselves Legion, they were tearing a man apart. Why? Because their whole spirit is rebellious. They're in competition with each other for the limited flesh home that they have available. They're trying to tear this guy apart to try to knock the other demons out, and they're destroying the man in the process. The devil doesn't have a kingdom that can stand. They're all against each other, and they're trying to turn us against each other as well, not just out in the world, but in this church, because we have not renewed our minds enough to the fact that when we die, our life doesn't end. This is not our expected end. We don't just go in the ground, get a bunch of dirt thrown onto us, and then slowly rot away into nothingness, despite what some people make you believe. There is more out there. You're an eternal being. That's why I'm glad this church puts so much emphasis on the children's ministry. Even the nursery. I was told many years ago by one of my mentors that the nursery is the single most important ministry in the church, because that's where people learn about God's love for the very first time. These are eternal people, and they're going to learn that if they receive Jesus, they are going to live forever with Him. And that's where it starts, with loving, nurturing care. And we got to renew our mindset to that. You ask kids where they're going to go when they die. Well, I'm going to go be with Jesus. They got it pretty simple. And kids, for the most part, are fearless. They have to be taught fear. If you've ever had a young child, hang over the edge of a balcony, or try to jump off the 4th or 5th step of the stairs, or hang upside down off a swing set, you realize they have no fear. You have to actually teach them, if you do that, the result might not be all that good. Maybe we should look at this and see a better way to do this. Do it without trying to teach them fear. Oh, you're going to get yourself killed. It's totally the wrong way to teach a child. I make a point not to preach about my own kids, but I will share this story briefly. One night, one of my daughters, I won't say which one, was trying to be a bit of a smart aleck and just hang her foot outside the bed, because she knows that bothers me. You get tucked in bed, you lay still, you settle your mind, you get ready to fall asleep. But she put her foot out the side of the bed, wanted to kick it like this just to have fun. I said, please don't do that. Put your foot in the bed. We need to still our minds and still our bodies. She kept doing it. Eventually, I said, if you leave your foot out like that, there are mice in this house, and they could run up and bite your toes. Now, that sounds cute, it sounds funny, but after that, she turned that over in her mind, over and over and over, to the point where she became afraid of mice. And she did not want to get up in the middle of the night. She wanted somebody to come and help her, because she didn't want to get out of the bed for fear that the mice might bite her. I had to repent of that, and I had to tell her, look, I should not have said that. That is not true. That is not going to happen to you. And it took a long time of me renewing her mind to that before she got over it. Mistake on my part. So I learned from that. But how do we learn to get over that? We learn by renewing our mind to the Word of God. We learn that, like Romans 10 says, if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe with our heart, meaning we grab a hold of it, like soil grabs hold of a seed of that word that Jesus was raised from the dead. If Jesus could be raised from the dead, we can be raised from the dead. Death is not the end for us. We're not headed for judgment. The end is not the end. It's not bad news. So no matter what the devil says, whatever kind of story he's going to spin for you, you tell him, you're a liar, you're a loser. First of all, tell him to shut up. You shouldn't say shut up in your home. In our home, that's a bad word. It's the S word. Shut up is not allowed. But you can tell the devil to shut up. That's perfectly okay. Shut up, you're a liar, and you're a loser, and nothing you say is true. I'm saved, I'm going to live forever with God, and you're not. You're going to burn forever with all your lies and all your sin and all your demons. And enjoy that. And people may say, well, I don't believe that. Okay, well, be surprised. That's fine. You know, I prefer you figure this out now. You'll be happier and better off, but be surprised. But it doesn't have to be that way. I believe that if we live fear-free at home and in the workplace and in the world at large, people will start to see a difference. They'll want to know, why do you live this way? I'm not talking like reckless fear, like hanging off the edge of a cliff. If you're a rock climber, that's fine, but don't do silly, risky stuff. I mean, when God calls you to do something, when he calls you to share the gospel, do it. When God calls you to sow into somebody, and that's your last $20, do it. When God tells you to pray for somebody's healing in public, do it. Just do it. God's provided everything you need for that. You're not running out of time. You're not running out of resources. You're certainly not going to run out of God's love. So when that fear comes on you, take a stand. And we're going to talk about that after the break.